The fluorescent lights of the diner flickered overhead, casting harsh shadows across Sarah Chen's tired face as she counted her tips for the third time, hoping the numbers would somehow change. They didn't. $42.63. Not even enough to cover the late fee on her rent, let alone the electric bill that had arrived that morning with its red final notice stamp bleeding through the envelope like a warning she couldn't ignore. She slid the crumpled bills into her apron pocket and glanced at the clock. 3:47 in the morning. Her shift had ended 20 minutes ago, but she'd stayed to help close because the manager had hinted at maybe, possibly, giving her extra hours next week. Maybe. Possibly. The language of her life had become conditional, built on maybes that rarely solidified into certainties. So outside, the streets of Portland glistened with recent rain. Sarah pulled her jacket tighter as she walked the 6 blocks to the bus stop, too exhausted to notice the beauty of the city lights reflecting in the puddles. Her feet ached in shoes she'd been wearing for 2 years, shoes with cardboard stuffed inside to cover the holes in the soles. At 31 years old, she looked older, worn down by the kind of poverty that wasn't dramatic or sudden, but slow and grinding, the kind that eroded hope one unpaid bill at a time. The apartment was dark when she finally arrived home just after 5. She moved quietly through the small space, past the pile of boxes in the corner that she still hadn't unpacked from their last move, past the kitchen where the refrigerator hummed its broken song, to the bedroom where her daughter slept. Emma, 7 years old, lay curled under a blanket Sarah had sewn from old clothes, her small face peaceful in sleep. Sarah stood in the doorway, watching the gentle rise and fall of her daughter's breathing, and felt the familiar weight settle on her chest. This was the 4th apartment in 3 years, each one smaller, cheaper, further from Emma's school. Each move another admission of failure, another step backward. Sarah had tried everything. 2 jobs, sometimes 3. Community college classes she'd eventually had to drop because she couldn't afford both tuition and groceries. Government assistance that barely covered the basics and came with paperwork that felt designed to humiliate. She changed out of her uniform and sat at the small table that served as desk, dining area, and craft station for Emma's school projects. Now, under the pile of junk mail and past due notices, she found the letter she'd been avoiding for 3 days. The envelope was thick, expensive-looking, addressed to her in elegant script. She'd assumed it was a credit card offer, another company eager to trap her deeper in debt. But tonight, exhausted beyond caring, she opened it. The letterhead read, "Whitmore and Associates Estate Attorneys." The words swam in front of her tired eyes as she tried to make sense of them. "Dear Ms. Chen, regarding the estate of Evelyn Margaret Hartley." Sarah blinked, confused. She didn't know anyone named Evelyn Hartley. She read on. "We have been attempting to locate the beneficiaries of the late Mrs. Hartley's estate for the past 18 months. Our research indicates that you are the granddaughter of Mrs. Hartley through your mother, Linda Chen, formerly Linda Hartley." Sarah's hands began to shake. Her mother had died when Sarah was 16, a car accident that had left her alone and eventually in foster care. Her mother had never spoken about her own family, never mentioned grandparents or relatives of any kind. Sarah had assumed there were none, that they'd been estranged or simply didn't exist. The letter continued with legal language she struggled to understand, but certain phrases jumped out at her. Sole surviving heir, property transfer, estate settlement. At the bottom, a phone number and an instruction to call within 30 days to claim her inheritance. Inheritance. The word felt foreign, almost ridiculous. People like Sarah didn't inherit things. They inherited debt, maybe, or the genetic lottery of bad luck, but not estates handled by lawyers with fancy letterhead. She set the letter down, convinced it was some kind of scam, an elaborate trick designed to steal the nothing she had left. But sleep wouldn't come. She lay in the darkness, listening to the sirens outside and the drip of the bathroom faucet she couldn't afford to fix, and thought about that word. Inheritance. What if it was real? What if there was something, even something small, that could give Emma a better Christmas than a few thrift store toys? What if there was enough to fix her car, which had been sitting dead in the parking lot for 2 months? By morning, she'd convinced herself to at least make the call. The worst that could happen was confirmation that it was indeed a scam, and she'd lost nothing but 15 minutes. The best that could happen, well, she didn't dare let herself imagine too much. Hope was dangerous when you had so little of it to spare. She waited until Emma left for school, walked to the library where she could use the phone for free, and dialed the number with trembling fingers. A receptionist answered, professional and distant, then transferred her to someone named Mr. Whitmore. His voice was kind, grandfatherly, and when he confirmed that yes, the letter was legitimate, and yes, she was indeed the sole heir to her grandmother's estate, Sarah had to sit down on the floor of the library. "What exactly am I inheriting?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Whitmore paused, and she could hear papers rustling. "A property," he said carefully. "The Hartley Grand Hotel in Astoria. It's been closed for approximately 12 years. The property has been held in trust pending the location of an heir." A hotel. Sarah tried to process this. Is it worth anything? Another pause. "Ms. Chen, I think it would be best if you came to our office. There are documents you'll need to review and sign. The property transfer can happen quite quickly once the paperwork is in order. Can you come by tomorrow?" She agreed, hung up, and sat on the library floor for a long time, stunned into immobility. A hotel. Her grandmother, whoever she had been, had owned a hotel. But Mr. Whitmore's careful tone, the way he'd avoided answering her question about value, sent a chill through her excitement. Something was wrong with this gift. Something that made a lawyer choose his words with such precision. That night, after Emma was asleep, Sarah searched for information about the Hartley Grand Hotel. What she found made her stomach sink. The hotel had indeed been grand once, a beautiful Victorian structure built in 1892, perched on a cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean. The photos from its heyday showed an elegant building with turrets and wraparound porches, the kind of place where wealthy travelers had once spent their summers. But the recent photos told a different story. The hotel had been abandoned, left to the elements. The roof had partially collapsed. Windows were broken or boarded up. Graffiti covered the lower walls. The grounds were overgrown with blackberry bushes and wild grass. One article from a local Astoria newspaper called it the town's most prominent eyesore, and reported that the city council had been trying for years to get the property condemned and demolished. Sarah stared at the images on the library computer screen, her brief hope curdling into something bitter. Of course her inheritance wasn't a miracle but another problem. A hotel so ruined that the city wanted it torn down. A building probably filled with mold and asbestos and structural damage that would cost more to fix than it could ever be worth. She almost laughed at the cosmic joke of it. Even her inheritance was a burden. The next day, she took the bus to the lawyer's office, leaving Emma with a neighbor who sometimes babysat. Mr. Whitmore's office was in a building downtown, for the kind with marble floors and oil paintings in the lobby. She felt out of place in her cleanest pair of jeans and a sweater with a small stain on the sleeve she'd tried to hide with a scarf. The receptionist looked at her with barely disguised judgment, and Sarah felt the familiar shame creep up her neck. But Mr. Whitmore himself was kind. He was in his 70s, with white hair and glasses, and he gestured her to a comfortable chair across from his massive desk. "Ms. Chen," he began, I want to start by telling you a bit about your grandmother, if you'll permit me." Sarah nodded, mute with curiosity and fear. "Evelyn Hartley was a remarkable woman," he continued. "She ran the Hartley Grand from 1965 until 2012, when health issues forced her to close it. She never married after your grandfather's death in 1970, and she poured everything into that hotel. It was her life." "Why didn't she ever contact my mother?" Sarah asked, the question that had been burning in her mind since the letter arrived. Mr. Whitmore's expression saddened. "There was an estrangement. Your mother left home at 17 after a disagreement about her choice to marry your father. Evelyn was, from what I understand, a woman of strong convictions and considerable pride. So was your mother. Neither reached out to the other, and by the time Evelyn wanted to reconcile, your mother had moved several times, and we couldn't locate her. She died when I was 16, Sarah said quietly. I didn't know I had a grandmother. Evelyn died 6 years ago, Mr. Whitmore said. She left instructions that we were to search for any surviving heirs. It took us time to trace the connection through your mother's various addresses and name change after marriage. I'm sorry it took so long to find you." He pushed a folder across the desk. Inside were photos of the hotel from its glory days, newspaper clippings about grand openings and celebrity guests, and the current photos Sarah had already seen online. "The property is legally yours, Ms. Chen. However, I must be honest with you about its condition. The hotel has been abandoned for 12 years. There is significant structural damage. The city of Astoria has declared it a hazard and wants it demolished. There are back taxes owed, though not an enormous amount. And there have been offers." "Offers?" Sarah looked up sharply. "To buy it?" "Not exactly," Mr. Whitmore said carefully. The city has offered to take it off your hands for $1 and handle the demolition themselves. A developer has offered $5,000 for the land, contingent on the building being torn down. Both parties are eager to resolve what they see as an eyesore problem. $1, $5,000 if she agreed to destruction. Sarah thought about her $42 in tips, about the rent she couldn't pay, about Emma's shoes that were too small. $5,000 would change everything. It would give them breathing room, time to plan, maybe even a chance to move somewhere better. "What would you advise?" she asked. Mr. Whitmore leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Professionally, I'm obligated to present you with all options and let you decide. Personally," he paused. "Your grandmother loved that hotel, Ms. Chen. She made me promise that if we found an heir, I would at least show them what she built before they made any decisions. Would you be willing to go see it? To see what it once was before you decide what it should become?" Something in his voice, a note of pleading wrapped in professional courtesy, made Sarah agree. They scheduled a visit for the following Saturday. Mr. Whitmore would drive her to Astoria himself, he insisted, and give her a tour. Sarah left his office with the folder of photos and a strange mixture of emotions she couldn't quite name. That night, she told Emma about the grandmother they'd never known and the hotel by the ocean. Emma's eyes grew wide with wonder. "Can we live there?" she asked, and Sarah's heart broke at the innocent hope in her daughter's voice. "It's not in good shape, my sweetheart," she explained gently. "It might have to be torn down." But Emma had already pulled out her crayons and begun drawing her vision of the hotel, complete with turrets and flags, and a sign that said, "Hartley Grand, home of Emma and Mama." Sarah watched her daughter create a fantasy from ruins and couldn't bring herself to extinguish that small flame of imagination. The days until Saturday crawled past. Sarah worked her shifts at the diner, deflecting questions from co-workers about why she seemed distracted. She researched the Hartley Grand obsessively, finding more photos, more articles. She learned that it had once hosted a president, that F. Scott Fitzgerald had supposedly stayed there in the 1920s, that it had been featured in a travel magazine as one of the Pacific Northwest's hidden gems. She also found the articles about its decline, how Evelyn Hartley had struggled to keep it running as tastes changed and travelers preferred modern amenities to historical charm, how a series of bad winters had damaged the structure, how financial problems had mounted until the doors finally closed in 2012. The last article she found was Evelyn's obituary, a brief notice that mentioned her life as a hotelier, but nothing about family. No survivors, it said, and Sarah felt an unexpected grief for this woman she'd never known, who died believing herself alone. Saturday morning arrived gray and drizzly, typical for November in Oregon. Mr. Whitmore picked Sarah up at 7, his sleek sedan a stark contrast to the rust-bucket cars in her apartment complex's parking lot. They drove north along Highway 101, on the Pacific Ocean appearing and disappearing through breaks in the coastal forest. Mr. Whitmore told stories about Evelyn, painting a picture of a formidable woman who'd run her hotel with exacting standards and surprising warmth. She knew every guest by name, he said. Even during the busy summer seasons when the hotel was fully booked, she would remember if someone preferred chamomile tea or Earl Grey, if they liked extra pillows or a room facing east for the sunrise. She built loyalty through those small attentions. People came back year after year, generation after generation. Why didn't she have any other family? Sarah asked. Why was it just her? Mr. Whitmore was quiet for a moment. She had a son, he finally said. Your uncle, though you never met him. He died in Vietnam in 1969. After that, after losing both her husband and her son within a year, the hotel became everything to her. Some people retreat into grief. Evelyn threw herself into work. They arrived in Astoria around 10. The town was charming, with Victorian houses climbing the hillside and the wide Columbia River stretching gray and massive to the north. Mr. Whitmore drove through the downtown, then up a winding road that hugged the cliffs above the ocean. And then, suddenly, there it was. The Hartley Grand Hotel stood like a wounded giant on a promontory overlooking the Pacific. Even in ruins, Sarah could see its former glory. The Victorian architecture was still evident in the remaining turrets and gables. The building was 3 stories tall, its bones suggesting elegance even as nature reclaimed it. But the damage was extensive. From the roof sagged dangerously in places and had collapsed entirely over what looked like the east wing. Windows gaped like empty eye sockets. The wraparound porch had partially rotted away, its railings broken and dangerous. Blackberry vines, thick as her arm, crawled up the walls, and the gardens that must have once been beautiful were now a jungle of overgrowth. Mr. Whitmore parked at a safe distance. I must warn you, Mrs. Chen, it's not safe to go inside. The structure is unstable. But Sarah was already out of the car, drawn forward despite his caution. She stopped at the edge of the property, taking in the scale of it. Behind the hotel, she could see outbuildings, what had probably been servant quarters or storage, equally ruined. To the side, a path led down the cliff toward the ocean, though it was overgrown and treacherous. So how much land? She asked. 12 acres, Mr. Whitmore replied. The hotel, outbuildings, gardens, and shoreline access. In its prime, guests could walk down to a private beach. That path hasn't been maintained in decades. Sarah moved closer to the hotel itself. Even from outside, she could see through broken windows into rooms filled with debris, water damage, and decay. A grand staircase was visible through what had once been the main entrance, its banister broken, but its curve still graceful. She could almost hear the echo of footsteps, the murmur of guests arriving for their seaside vacation, the clink of glasses in what must have been a dining room. What would it cost to fix? She asked, though she already knew the answer would be impossible. Mr. Whitmore sighed. Conservatively, Several $1 million. The structural issues alone would require extensive work. Then there's the electrical, plumbing, roof, windows, restoration of historical features. Even if you had the money, which I know you don't, the city might not even allow the work. They've been pushing for demolition. Several million. Sarah almost laughed. She couldn't even scrape together several hundred for rent. The gap between what this place needed and what she could provide was so vast, it was almost funny. Almost. I should just take the $5,000, she said flatly. Let them tear it down and be done with it. Mr. Whitmore didn't argue, but he did say, "Would you like to see the photos first? The ones from when it was operating? Your grandmother kept meticulous records. They're in my car." They sat in his sedan with the heater running, flipping through albums that Evelyn had apparently maintained for decades. Sarah saw the hotel in its glory, rooms decorated with antiques and fresh flowers, a dining room with white tablecloths and crystal, a library with floor-to-ceiling books, guest rooms with ocean views and four-poster beds. She saw photos of Evelyn herself, a stern-looking woman with sharp eyes and an elegant bearing, standing in front of her hotel with pride. And she saw photos of people who were clearly her family. A young man in a military uniform, her uncle, smiling before Vietnam. A woman who looked startlingly like Sarah herself, her mother as a teenager, before the estrangement. There were baby photos, birthday parties, Christmases celebrated in the hotel's grand lobby. A family that had once existed, now reduced to images and a crumbling building. Sarah closed the last album and sat in silence. The rain had started again, pattering against the car windows. Through the rain-streaked glass, she could see the ruined hotel, and beyond it, the endless gray Pacific. "I need to think," she said finally. Mr. Whitmore nodded. "Take your time. You have 30 days to make a decision before the city forces the issue. Whatever you choose, Miss Chen, I'll help you with the paperwork." They drove back to Portland in silence. Sarah's mind churned with calculations that all led to the same conclusion. She had no choice but to let it go. Take the money, pay her debts, start over. The hotel was beautiful once, but once was a long time ago. She couldn't save it. She could barely save herself. But when she got home and Emma asked about the hotel, Sarah found herself describing not the ruin they'd seen, but the glory she'd seen in the photos. She told Emma about the grand staircase and the ocean views, about the library and the dining room. She told her about Evelyn, the grandmother they'd never known, who'd built something magnificent and lost everything trying to keep it. "Are we going to fix it?" Emma asked with the absolute faith children have that their parents can do anything. Sarah wanted to say no, to be realistic, to prepare her daughter for disappointment. But looking at Emma's hopeful face, she found herself saying, "I don't know yet, sweetheart. I have to figure some things out first." That night, after Emma was asleep, Sarah sat at the small table and did what she always did when facing an impossible problem. She made a list. On one side, she wrote all the reasons to accept the $5,000 and walk away. On the other, and she wrote nothing, because there were no logical reasons to try to save a hotel she couldn't afford to fix in a town where she didn't live, that the city wanted demolished. But logic wasn't the only voice in her head. There was another voice, quieter but insistent, whispering about legacy and family, and the woman who died alone thinking she had no one. Whispering about Emma growing up in apartments that got smaller and cheaper, about dreams deferred so many times they disappeared entirely. Whispering that maybe, just maybe, there was more to the hotel than appeared on the surface. Sarah told herself she was being foolish, told herself that desperation was making her grasp at fantasies. But she also remembered Mr. Whitmore's careful words, the way he'd avoided certain questions, the suggestion that she see the place before deciding. If it was truly worthless, truly beyond saving, why insist she visit? She opened her laptop, the old one that barely worked, and began researching. Not the hotel this time, but the land it sat on. 12 acres of clifftop property overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Even if the building was worthless, surely the land had value. She found similar properties in Astoria listed for prices that made her head spin. Raw land, far from the ocean, going for hundreds of thousands. Developed properties, homes with views, selling for millions. But when she searched for recent sales of the Hartley property, she found nothing. No listings, no valuations, nothing. It was as if the property existed in a blind spot, invisible to the real estate market that should have been salivating over oceanfront acreage. That didn't make sense. Unless... Sarah's heart began to beat faster. Unless there was some kind of restriction on the property, some legal issue that prevented normal sale. She dug deeper, searching through property records and county files available online. And there, buried in documents from the 1920s, she found it. The Hartley Grand Hotel sat on land that had been designated as part of a historical trust. When Evelyn's grandfather had built the hotel in 1892, he'd placed restrictions on the property to preserve it for future generations. The land could not be subdivided. The original structure could not be demolished without extensive approval processes. And most importantly, the property could only pass to direct heirs, not be sold to outside parties without first offering it to any surviving family members. That was why the city couldn't just condemn and demolish it. Why the developer's offer was contingent on destruction and only $5,000. They could buy the land, but they couldn't do anything with it while the hotel still stood, and they couldn't tear down the hotel without approval that would take years to obtain. The historical trust had protected Evelyn's legacy, but it had also trapped it in a kind of limbo. Sarah sat back, her mind racing. She was the heir. She could accept the property and the restrictions, or she could sign waivers giving up all rights and letting others deal with the legal maze. That was what they were hoping she'd do. Take the small sum and sign away the complications. But if she accepted it, if she became the legal owner, then the restrictions would work for her, not against her. No one could force her to sell. No one could force demolition. The property was protected, and as the heir, she had rights that others didn't. Rights, but no money. That was still the impossible wall. She could own a protected historical property and still be unable to do anything with it. The discovery of the trust felt important, but it didn't change her fundamental reality. She was broke, exhausted, and drowning. A legal protection didn't pay bills. She was about to close the laptop when one more search result caught her eye. An article from a preservation magazine, 5 years old, about successful hotel restorations funded by historical grants. She clicked through and began reading about programs she'd never known existed. State historical societies that provided funding, federal preservation grants, to tax incentives for restoring designated landmarks, crowdfunding campaigns for community restoration projects. The article profiled a hotel in Maine, abandoned for 15 years, that had been brought back through a combination of grants, community investment, and phased restoration. The owner, like Sarah, had inherited a ruin with no money to fix it. But she'd applied for every grant she could find, rallied the local community, and 5 years later, the hotel was operating again. Sarah read the article 3 times, searching for catches, for reasons it wouldn't work for her. The timeline was long, years, not months. The work was grueling, basically a full-time job on top of whatever else the owner did for money. The success wasn't guaranteed. For every restored hotel, dozens were demolished. But it was possible. Possible. And she looked at the time. 3 in the morning. In 6 hours, she had to be at the diner for the breakfast shift. But she wasn't tired anymore. She was awake with a dangerous kind of hope, the kind that could lead her into disaster or transformation. She thought about Emma's drawing of the hotel, flags flying, the two of them safe inside. And she thought about Evelyn, alone at the end, the hotel closed, believing she'd failed. What would it mean to try? To take this broken inheritance and pour everything into saving it? Sarah knew she would probably fail, knew that the smart choice, the safe choice, was still to take the money and walk away. But when had playing it safe ever gotten her anywhere but here, broke and desperate and stuck? The sun was rising by the time she made her decision. She would accept the property, and she would become the owner of the Hartley Grand Hotel. And somehow, some way, she would find a path forward. Not because it made sense, but because the alternative, giving up before even trying, felt like betraying not just her grandmother, but herself. Maybe she would fail. Probably she would fail. But at least she would fail trying to build something instead of just surviving. She called Mr. Whitmore's office as soon as it opened and left a message. "I want to accept the inheritance," she said. "All of it. The hotel, the restrictions, everything. When can we start the paperwork?" Then she hung up before she could change her mind and went to wake Emma for school, carrying the dangerous hope carefully, like a candle in the wind. The paperwork took 3 weeks, 3 weeks during which Sarah worked her shifts at the diner and came home to her cramped apartment and filled out forms late into the night. Applications for grants, requests for property assessments, letters to the Oregon Historical Society. Each form asked questions she couldn't fully answer, required documentation she didn't have, demanded fees she could barely scrape together. Mr. Whitmore helped where he could, waiving some of his own fees and guiding her through the legal maze. But even with his assistance, the process felt like climbing a mountain made of paper. Every step forward revealed 10 more steps she hadn't anticipated. Her co-workers at the diner noticed the change in her, noticed the dark circles under her eyes, the way she'd pull out her phone during breaks to research historical preservation instead of scrolling social media like everyone else. One of the waitresses, a woman named Denise, who'd worked at the diner for 15 years, finally asked her about it. "You doing okay, Sarah? You seem distracted." Sarah hesitated, then found herself explaining about the hotel, about the grandmother she'd never known, the inheritance that was more burden than blessing, her decision to try saving it despite the impossibility. Denise listened, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern, to something that looked uncomfortably like pity. "Honey," she said gently, "you can barely keep your head above water as it is. Why would you take on something that's going to drag you under?" It was a fair question. Sarah had asked herself the same thing 100 times. "Because," she said slowly, "what if I don't? What if I take the money and walk away and spend the rest of my life wondering what could have been? No, at least if I try and fail, I'll know I gave it everything." Denise shook her head but didn't argue further. The look on her face said everything. This was a mistake, a poor person's fantasy that would end in more debt and heartbreak. Sarah saw that look a lot in the following days. From her landlord when she explained she'd be moving out at the end of the month. From Emma's teacher when she mentioned they'd be relocating to Astoria. From the woman at the bank when she tried to open a business account with $73. Everyone thought she was making a terrible decision, and maybe they were right. But Sarah had spent her whole life playing it safe, doing what she was supposed to do, staying small and manageable. Where had it gotten her? To a life of constant stress, of tips that didn't cover bills, or of watching her daughter grow up in poverty despite Sarah's best efforts. At least this was a different kind of struggle, one with possibility attached to it, however slim. The day the deed transfer became official, Mr. Whitmore invited her back to his office. He handed her a large envelope containing the property deed, keys to the hotel, and something else. A leather-bound journal. "This was your grandmother's," he said. "She left it with instructions that if we found an heir, they should have it." I looked through it briefly. It's mostly hotel records, guest logs, financial notes. But she also wrote personal reflections. I thought you might want to know her better. Sarah took the journal with trembling hands. The leather was worn smooth with age, the pages inside yellowed but filled with Evelyn's precise handwriting. She opened to a random page and read, July 15th, 1978. The Morrison family returned today for their 10th summer with us. Little Timothy is no longer little, nearly as tall as his father now. He asked if the same room was available, the one with the window seat where he used to read. Of course it was. Some traditions matter more than revenue. These are the moments that make this work worthwhile. Not the profit margins, but the memories we help create. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. This was a woman who'd understood something about value that couldn't be measured in dollars, who'd built a place not just for profit, but for connection, for tradition, for the small moments that made life meaningful. And Sarah was about to try to resurrect that vision with nothing but determination and a prayer. As she and Emma moved to Astoria on a cold December morning, everything they owned fit into a borrowed van. They'd said goodbye to Portland, to the apartment that had never felt like home, to the few friends Sarah had made at the diner. Emma was excited, treating it as an adventure, but Sarah's stomach churned with anxiety as they drove north. They couldn't move into the hotel, obviously. The structure wasn't safe, probably wasn't even legally habitable in its current state. Instead, Sarah had found the cheapest rental she could in Astoria proper, a small cottage on the edge of town owned by an elderly man named Harold, who'd agreed to let her pay month to month. The cottage was tiny, barely bigger than their Portland apartment, but it had a yard where Emma could play and a view of the river in the distance. "Is this temporary?" Emma asked as they unloaded boxes. "Until we fix the hotel?" Sarah swallowed hard. "Maybe, sweetheart. We'll see how things go." She didn't have the heart to tell her daughter that fixing the hotel might be a dream that never materialized, that this cottage might be where they stayed for years, that the hotel might remain a ruin they visited but never inhabited. The next morning, Sarah drove out to the Hartley Grand alone. She wanted to see it again, to really see it now that it was legally hers before she brought Emma. Mr. Whitmore's warnings about structural instability rang in her ears, but she couldn't own a place without at least walking through it, understanding what she'd inherited. The December day was clear and cold, the Pacific a deep gray blue beneath a pale sky. The hotel looked even more forlorn than she remembered, its Victorian elegance turned Gothic by neglect. Sarah parked and approached slowly, noting where the porch sagged dangerously, where walls had water damage visible even from outside, where the roof's collapse had left gaping holes. She found what had once been the main entrance, its double doors hanging askew. With extreme caution, testing each step, she entered. The smell hit her first. Mold, rot, decades of decay. The lobby that had looked grand in photographs was a disaster. The ceiling had collapsed in places, leaving beams exposed and insulation hanging like dead moss. Water damage had stained the walls in dark rivers. The grand staircase still stood, but several steps were broken, and the banister leaned at a dangerous angle. Sarah moved through the ground floor, cataloging the devastation. The dining room where guests had once enjoyed elegant meals was filled with debris. The kitchen was a nightmare of rusted appliances and destroyed cabinetry. A library that must have been beautiful, with built-in shelves reaching to a high ceiling, now housed only mildew and the rotted remains of books. Every room told the same story: beauty destroyed by time and weather. Sarah felt despair settling over her, like the dust that coated everything. What had she been thinking? This wasn't a restoration project. This was demolition waiting to happen. The structure was so compromised that fixing it would mean essentially rebuilding from scratch. She didn't have the money for that. She didn't have a fraction of the money for that. She was about to leave, to give up before truly beginning, when she noticed something odd. In what had been the hotel office, behind a collapsed bookshelf, she saw a door. Not a regular door, but something heavier, made of metal. She climbed carefully over the debris and examined it more closely. It was a safe room door, or perhaps a vault, the kind of thing old hotels sometimes had for storing guest valuables. The handle was rusted, but when Sarah pulled, it resisted with the weight of something sealed, not just stuck. Her pulse quickened. She pulled harder, throwing her weight into it, and finally felt something give. The door opened with a groan that echoed through the empty hotel. Inside was a small room, perhaps 8 feet square, its walls lined with built-in cabinets and shelves. Unlike the rest of the hotel, this room was dry. The seal on the door had apparently held for decades, protecting the interior from the water damage that had destroyed everything else. Sarah stepped inside, her heart pounding. The cabinets held hotel records, leather-bound ledgers documenting decades of guests and transactions. She pulled one open and saw entry after entry in careful handwriting. Names, dates, room numbers, payment amounts. But it was what sat on the top shelf that made her breath catch. Wooden boxes, old and dusty, but intact. She pulled one down, her hands shaking, and opened it. Inside, wrapped in yellowed cloth, were pieces of silver. A tea service, tarnished but unmistakably real silver, each piece engraved with the hotel's crest. She opened another box and found more. Silver candlesticks, serving trays, an ornate punch bowl. Her grandmother had mentioned in several journal entries that she'd packed away the hotel's silver service, unable to bear using or selling what had been in the family since the hotel opened. Sarah had assumed it was long gone, stolen by vandals, or sold off during hard times. But here it was, locked away and forgotten, protected by a sealed room in a collapsing building. She sat down hard on the floor, silver pieces surrounding her, and started to laugh. It was half hysteria, half genuine amusement at the absurdity. She owned a hotel that was falling down, but she also owned what might be thousands of dollars worth of antique silver. It wasn't a fortune. It wasn't enough to restore the hotel. But it was something. Something more than nothing. Sarah spent the rest of the day carefully transporting the silver to her car, making multiple trips and cataloging each piece. She also took several of the ledgers, curious about the hotel's history. That evening, after Emma was in bed, she sat at the cottage's small kitchen table and began to research. The silver service was indeed valuable. Based on hallmarks and condition, she estimated it might bring $15,000 to $20,000 at auction. Not a fortune, but enough to start with. Enough to pay for proper structural assessments, maybe even begin some basic repairs. It felt like a sign, like Evelyn reaching across time to help her granddaughter, offering tools for the fight ahead. Over the next week, Sarah threw herself into the work of understanding what she'd inherited. She hired a structural engineer to assess the building, a kind man named Robert, who'd worked on historical restorations before. His report was sobering but not entirely hopeless. "The foundation is actually solid," he told her, walking through the building with careful steps. That's the good news. Victorian builders knew what they were doing. The bad news is, pretty much everything above the foundation needs extensive work. The roof is critical. It needs to be completely replaced before more water damage occurs. Several load-bearing walls have been compromised. All the electrical and plumbing is ancient and unusable. You're looking at a full gut renovation. Cost? Sarah asked, though she dreaded the answer. Robert sighed. To do it right? Preserve the historical elements, meet current code, make it safe and habitable? I'd estimate $2 to $3 million, minimum. That's if everything goes smoothly, which it never does with buildings this old. 2 to 3 million. The number was so far beyond her reach it was almost abstract. She might as well need 20 million or 200 million. It was impossible either way. But Robert wasn't done. However, he said carefully, if you're willing to do a phased restoration, that changes things. Start with emergency stabilization to prevent further collapse. That's maybe 50 to 70,000. Then roof replacement, another 100,000. Once the building is weather-tight, you could work on sections at a time, funding each phase as you go. It would take years, maybe a decade, but it's theoretically possible. And where would I get even the first 50,000? Sarah asked flatly. Robert gave her a sympathetic look. Grants. The hotel is on the National Register of Historic Places, so did you know that? That opens up federal and state preservation funds. You won't get everything you need, but you might get 30 to 40%. The rest, he shrugged. Loans, investors, crowdfunding, selling pieces like that silver you mentioned. It's a puzzle, and you'll be solving it for a long time. But I've seen people do it. After he left, Sarah sat on the ruined porch, looking out at the ocean. The enormity of the task threatened to crush her, but she thought about Robert's words. A puzzle, pieces you solve one at a time. She'd been solving puzzles her whole life, figuring out how to stretch $15 until payday, how to keep Emma fed and clothed on nothing, how to survive. This was just a bigger puzzle. She started writing grant applications, hours and hours of paperwork, not describing the hotel's historical significance, outlining restoration plans, making the case that the Hartley Grand deserved preservation. She wrote letters to historical societies, to preservation organizations, to anyone who might care about saving a piece of Oregon's past. And slowly, grudgingly, Astoria began to notice her. A reporter from the local paper came out to do a story. Local woman inherits historic hotel, plans restoration, the headline read. The article was sympathetic, but doubtful. It mentioned the hotel's glory days, its decades of abandonment, and Sarah's ambitious plans. Between the lines, the skepticism was clear. Nice idea, but it'll never happen. The story brought both support and mockery. Some locals remembered the hotel fondly, recalled staying there as children or hearing their parents' stories. These people stopped Sarah on the street to wish her well, to share memories. But others were less kind. At the hardware store, buying basic supplies, Sarah overheard two men talking. That woman who bought the old Hartley place? Crazy. That building's been dead for years. Should have just let them tear it down. His companion agreed. Waste of time and money. She'll give up in a few months, you watch. Then we'll finally get rid of that eyesore. Sarah pretended not to hear, but the words stung. They weren't wrong to be skeptical. She was a single mother with no money, no experience in construction or hospitality, trying to resurrect a building that had defeated everyone else who'd considered it. On paper, it was ridiculous. But Sarah had spent her life being underestimated, being told she couldn't, shouldn't, wouldn't succeed. And while she'd often believed those voices, internalized them, this time felt different. This time, she had something to prove, not just to others, but to herself. She wasn't going to let the hotel die without a fight. The Christmas season arrived, bringing rain and wind that battered the coast. Sarah spent Emma's school hours at the hotel, doing what work she could alone, clearing debris, documenting damage, making lists. The physical labor was exhausting but oddly satisfying. Each bucket of rubble removed felt like progress, however small. It was during one of these clearing sessions, working in what had been a ground-floor storage room, that Sarah made her second discovery. Behind stacks of old furniture and broken equipment, she found a door she hadn't noticed before. It was partially hidden, painted the same color as the wall, and easy to miss. When she pried it open, she found stairs leading down. A basement. Of course, the hotel would have a basement. Sarah grabbed her flashlight and descended carefully, testing each step. The air grew cooler and damper as she went down. At the bottom, she found herself in a large cellar that seemed to extend under much of the hotel's footprint. The basement was surprisingly dry, the thick stone walls having held up better than the wooden structure above. She swept her flashlight around, revealing old boilers, coal bins, storage areas. And in the far corner, another door. This one made of heavy wood, with an old-fashioned padlock. Sarah's hands trembled as she approached it. The padlock was rusted but not impossible. She went back upstairs, found a crowbar in her car, and returned to break it open. The lock snapped after several tries, and she pulled the door wide. Wine cellar. That's what the room had been. Racks lined the walls, most empty now. But as Sarah's flashlight played across the space, she saw that not all the racks were bare. In the back, bottles lay in their cradles, dusty and forgotten. She approached slowly, afraid to hope, afraid to believe what she was seeing. The bottles were old. Really old. Some had labels so faded she couldn't read them, but others were legible. French wines, prestigious vineyards, vintages from the 1940s, 50s, 60s. Sarah knew nothing about wine, but she knew enough to understand that old bottles from famous vineyards could be valuable. How valuable, she had no idea. But the fact that they'd been here, undisturbed, for decades, suggested something significant. She carefully removed one bottle, and cradling it like a baby, and brought it upstairs into the light. The label read, Chateau Lafite Rothschild, 1945. Sarah pulled out her phone and searched. Her eyes widened as results appeared. A bottle of 1945 Lafite had sold at auction for over $150,000. One bottle. And she'd seen at least a dozen in the cellar, maybe more. She rushed back downstairs and began counting. 23 bottles total, from various vineyards and years. Not all would be as valuable as the Lafite, she knew that. But if even half of them were worth significant money. Sarah sat down on the cellar floor, flashlight in one hand, bottle in the other, and tried to comprehend what she'd found. Her grandmother had created a time capsule, preserving the hotel's most valuable assets, while the building crumbled around them. The silver service, now the wine cellar. What else had Evelyn hidden? What other treasures lay waiting in this enormous, decaying structure? For the first time since making the decision to accept the inheritance, Sarah felt hope that wasn't tinged with desperation. Real, solid hope based on tangible assets. The wine alone, if authenticated and sold properly, could fund the first phase of restoration. Maybe even the second. It wouldn't solve everything, but it was a genuine path forward, not just wishful thinking. She spent the rest of that day carefully cataloging every bottle, photographing labels, researching values. The total, if her estimates were even close to accurate, was staggering. Potentially $700,000 to $1 million, depending on condition and auction performance. Enough to start, enough to prove she wasn't crazy. That night, after Emma was asleep, Sarah sat with Evelyn's journal and found an entry from 1968. Moved the last of the wine cellar's finest vintages to the lower storage today. Can't bear to serve them anymore, not with prices what they've become, and guests who wouldn't appreciate the difference between a 45 Lafite and a bottle from the grocery store. Perhaps someday, when times are better, we'll open them for special occasions. For now, they'll keep. Good wine only improves with age, after all. Unlike hotels and old women, which merely fall apart. Sarah smiled through tears. Her grandmother had known what she was preserving, had protected these bottles through decades of struggle, unable to bring herself to sell them even when the hotel's finances demanded it. And now they would serve their purpose, after all, funding the restoration of the place Evelyn had loved. But Sarah's excitement was tempered by practical concerns. She couldn't just sell the wine at a random shop. Bottles this old and valuable needed authentication, proper auction handling, legal documentation. And she'd need to keep the discovery quiet until everything was secure. If word got out that the abandoned hotel contained a fortune in wine, vandals would find a way in. She contacted an auction house in Portland that specialized in rare wines. The representative, a man named Marcus Chen, no relation, though Sarah found the coincidence amusing, agreed to come examine the bottles after the new year. If they're authentic and in good condition, he told her over the phone, and those vintages check out, you're sitting on a significant find. But I'll need to verify everything in person. So Sarah kept her discovery secret, telling no one except Mr. Whitmore, who advised her on the legal aspects of selling inherited property. She continued her days of clearing rubble and writing grant applications, but now with a sense of purpose that had been missing before. She was going to make this work. Somehow, impossibly, she was going to save the Hartley Grand. Christmas came, and Sarah and Emma celebrated in the cottage with a small tree and modest gifts. Emma made Sarah a card showing the hotel restored, with a garden full of flowers and a sign that said, "Open." Sarah hung it on the refrigerator and looked at it every morning, letting her daughter's faith fuel her own flagging confidence. The day after Christmas, Sarah returned to the hotel for more clearing work. The weather had turned bitter, a wind howling off the ocean and rain lashing the exposed portions of the building. She was working in one of the upper rooms, documenting damage, when she heard something that made her freeze. Voices. Men's voices, coming from somewhere below. Sarah's heart hammered. Had someone broken in? She crept quietly to the stairwell and listened. 2 men, maybe 3, moving through the ground floor. She heard laughter, the crash of something being knocked over, and words that chilled her. Old place like this, there's got to be something valuable left. Copper pipes, maybe, or those old light fixtures. Rich people who built this didn't use cheap stuff. Sarah descended the stairs as quietly as she could, phone in hand, ready to call the police. But when she reached the lobby, she saw them. 3 young men, maybe in their 20s, carrying tools and wearing hoodies. They'd pried open one of the boarded windows and let themselves in. "This is private property," Sarah said, her voice steadier than she felt. "You need to leave. Now." The men turned, surprised, but not particularly concerned. The tallest one grinned. "Relax, lady. We're just looking around. Building's abandoned, right? No harm done." "It's not abandoned. I own it. And you're trespassing." The grin faded. "You're that woman from the paper, the one trying to fix this dump." He looked around pointedly at the decay surrounding them. "Good luck with that. Place is done. Might as well let us take what's left." "Get out," Sarah said firmly, "or I'm calling the police." She held up her phone. The men exchanged glances, then shrugged. They walked toward the broken window they'd entered through. But as they left, one of them called back, "You're wasting your time. Building's gonna fall down around you. Probably kill you when it does." Sarah watched them disappear into the rain, then immediately called the police anyway. An officer came out, took a report, and said he'd increase patrols in the area. "But honestly, ma'am," he told her, "this place is a target. It's been empty so long, people think it's fair game. Until you get it secured properly, this'll keep happening." She knew he was right. The hotel needed to be sealed up, made inaccessible to vandals and thieves. But that required money she didn't have yet. She'd applied for emergency stabilization grants, but those took months to process. In the meantime, the building sat vulnerable, and now people knew she'd found something valuable enough to claim ownership. That evening, Sarah had a conversation with Harold, her landlord. He was in his 80s, a retired fisherman who'd lived in Astoria his whole life. Over cups of tea in his kitchen, she told him about the break-in and her worries. Harold listened thoughtfully, then said something that surprised her. "I remember that hotel when it was running. My wife and I celebrated our 20th anniversary there, back in 1985. Beautiful place, beautiful night. Mrs. Hartley, your grandmother, she made us feel like royalty. Upgraded our room, sent up champagne, the works. Didn't charge us extra, just said some occasions deserved to be special." He smiled at the memory. "My Ellen passed 5 years ago, but I still remember that night at the Hartley Grand. Best anniversary we ever had." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you for telling me that." Harold nodded. "Point is, that place meant something to people. Still does. You're going to face a lot of folks telling you to quit, that it's impossible, that you're foolish. But some of us remember what it was. Some of us think it's worth saving." He patted her hand. "You need anything, you let me know. I may be old, but I can still swing a hammer if you need an extra pair of hands." That simple offer of support, after a day of confrontations and doubts, nearly undid Sarah. She thanked him profusely and walked back to her cottage feeling less alone. The task ahead was still enormous, still probably impossible. But at least she wasn't entirely without allies. The new year arrived with a storm that battered the coast for 3 straight days. Sarah watched weather reports anxiously, worried about additional damage to the hotel's compromised roof. When the storm finally passed, she drove out to assess the damage and found her worst fears realized. A section of the remaining roof had collapsed, opening the 2nd floor to the elements. Water had poured in, destroying rooms that had been relatively intact before. Sarah stood in the rain, staring at the fresh devastation, and felt despair threaten to overwhelm her. Every time she made progress, every time she found a glimmer of hope, something went wrong. The building itself seemed determined to defeat her. She was about to leave when she noticed something odd. The roof collapse had exposed part of the 3rd floor, an area she hadn't been able to access before due to structural concerns. Through the gap, she could see what looked like an attic space, and visible even from the ground was a trunk, old and substantial, sitting against what remained of the far wall. Sarah knew she shouldn't climb up there. The structure was even more unstable after the collapse. But something about that trunk called to her. She found a ladder in one of the outbuildings, positioned it carefully, and climbed. The ascent terrified her, each step a test of courage. But she made it to the 3rd floor, and stepping very carefully on beams she hoped would hold, reached the trunk. It was locked, but the lock was old and weak. She forced it open and lifted the lid. Inside, protected from decades of water damage by the trunk's tight seal, were papers, documents, and something else wrapped in oilcloth. Sarah carefully unwrapped the bundle and gasped. Jewelry. Antique jewelry. Pieces that glowed even in the dim light filtering through the destroyed roof. Necklaces, rings, brooches, so all showing the craftsmanship of another era. She lifted a necklace into better light and saw that the stones, deep green, might be emeralds. Real emeralds, set in gold that had barely tarnished. Her hands shook as she examined piece after piece. Some were simple, elegant designs. Others were ornate, clearly expensive even when new. The documents in the trunk explained what she'd found. Insurance appraisals from the 1950s, listing the jewelry as belonging to Evelyn Hartley. Estate jewelry, family heirlooms, valued at. The amounts made Sarah's head spin, and these were 1950s valuations. Today's values would be exponentially higher. Beneath the appraisals were letters. Personal correspondence between Evelyn and her husband before his death. Love letters, sweet and intimate, and one letter in particular that made Sarah's breath catch. It was from Evelyn's grandfather, the hotel's founder, to his daughter, Evelyn's mother. It described the family's history, their journey from England to America, the fortune they'd built, and the legacy they'd tried to preserve. The jewelry pieces have been in our family for 4 generations, the letter read. Some were purchased during prosperous times. Others are even older, brought from England when we emigrated. They represent not just monetary value, but the continuity of family, the chain of lives that led to you. Guard them well, pass them on with love, and remember that wealth is not merely gold and gems, but the memories we create and the love we share. Sarah sat on the attic floor, jewelry in her lap, and wept. Evelyn had hidden her most precious possessions, not just from thieves, but from the necessity of selling them during hard times. She'd preserved them against hope that someday someone would appreciate their true value, both monetary and sentimental. And now Sarah held them, this inheritance of gems and memories. She thought about selling them, about what they could fund. Thought about keeping them, preserving them as Evelyn had intended, and realized she could do both. Some pieces could be sold to save the hotel. Others could be kept, worn again, returned to life as they were meant to be. She carefully packed everything back into the trunk and, with enormous effort, managed to lower it by rope to the ground floor and then to her car. The trunk was heavy, filled not just with jewelry but with the weight of generations. As she drove back to the cottage, Sarah felt the presence of her ancestors somehow, the chain of women who'd loved the hotel, who'd sacrificed to keep it alive, who'd hidden treasures for a granddaughter they'd never meet. That night, she laid the jewelry out on her bed, cataloging each piece by the light of her bedside lamp. The emerald necklace, the sapphire brooch, the gold rings with stones she couldn't identify, and documents proving provenance, proving these weren't stolen goods, but legitimate inheritance. Marcus from the auction house would examine the wine in 2 weeks. She'd ask him about the jewelry, too, about proper authentication and sale. Sarah looked at Emma sleeping in the next room, at the modest cottage that was their temporary home, at the journal lying open on her nightstand to one of Evelyn's entries. And she thought about the hotel standing in the rain, wounded but not yet defeated, holding secrets in every shadow. The mockery and doubt from others no longer stung quite so much, because Sarah knew something they didn't. Knew that the Hartley Grand wasn't just a ruin. It was a treasure vault, each discovery funding the next phase of restoration. Evelyn had prepared for this, had left the tools her heir would need, if only that heir was brave enough to search for them. And Sarah was brave, terrified, exhausted, often near breaking, but brave. She would save this hotel, not just for herself, not just for Emma, but for Evelyn and the chain of women who came before, for the memories Harold and others held of the place, for the possibility that legacy mattered, that some things were worth fighting impossible odds to preserve. She closed the trunk, locked it, and hid it in her closet under blankets and boxes. Tomorrow she'd figure out next steps. Tonight, she'd allow herself to feel the weight lift slightly. Feel hope that wasn't desperate, but earned. The Hartley Grand had given her its gifts. Now she had to prove herself worthy of them. Marcus Chen arrived on a gray January morning, driving up from Portland, in a van equipped with climate-controlled storage for transporting valuable wines. Sarah met him at the hotel, nervous energy making her hands shake as she unlocked the main entrance. She'd spent the previous day clearing a safe path to the basement, making sure nothing would obstruct their access to the wine cellar. Marcus was younger than she'd expected, maybe 40, with an easy manner that put her somewhat at ease. He carried specialized equipment on temperature gauges, authentication tools, lights for examining bottles in detail. "Ms. Chen," he said, shaking her hand, "I have to tell you, I'm skeptical. I get calls all the time from people who think they've found treasure in Grandma's attic. Usually it's bottles worth $50 being presented as priceless artifacts. But your photos were intriguing enough to make the drive." Sarah led him through the ruined hotel, watching his expression shift from professional courtesy to genuine surprise as he took in the scale of the building. "This was some place," he murmured, looking up at the damaged grand staircase. "Victorian seaside hotel. These were the crown jewels of coastal tourism in their day." In the basement, Marcus's skepticism evaporated entirely. He approached the wine cellar with the reverence of someone entering a church, on his flashlight playing across the dusty bottles. He examined the first bottle, the 1945 Lafite, with meticulous care, checking the fill level, the condition of the cork, the label's authenticity, the color of the wine visible through the glass. "My God," he breathed, "this is real. This is actually real." He looked at Sarah with something approaching awe. "Do you understand what you have here?" Over the next 3 hours, Marcus examined every bottle. He took notes, photographs, readings. Some bottles had deteriorated, their corks failed, the wine likely spoiled. But most, protected by the cool, stable environment of the sealed cellar, had survived in remarkable condition. When he finally compiled his assessment, his hands trembled slightly as he wrote the figures. "Conservative auction estimate," he said, showing Sarah his tablet. "Why, is $850,000. That's being cautious. If the auction goes well, if collectors get competitive, you could see over $1 million, possibly significantly over." Sarah had to sit down. She'd hoped, but hoping and hearing confirmation were entirely different things. "How long until auction?" "We'll need to move carefully," Marcus explained. "Authentication, documentation, marketing to serious collectors. I'd recommend a spring auction, April or May. That gives us time to build anticipation, to get the right buyers in the room or online. We're talking about a once-in-a-generation find. Stories like this don't happen often, and when they do, they make news." He paused. "Which brings me to something important. This will go public. Has to, for the auction to work. Aunt, are you prepared for that?" Sarah thought about the men who'd broken into the hotel, about the mockery she'd already faced. Will it put the rest of the hotel at risk? There's more here than just wine. Marcus considered. "You'll need security, professional security, until the bottles are safely in our vault. And you should probably be vague about any other discoveries. Let the wine be the story. That's dramatic enough on its own." They agreed on terms. Marcus would transport the bottles to Portland immediately, store them in climate-controlled security, and begin the authentication process. Sarah would receive regular updates and would need to travel to Portland for the auction itself. They shook hands, and Sarah watched him carefully pack each bottle into specialized containers. As his van disappeared down the coastal road, Sarah sat on the hotel's front steps and let herself cry. Not from sadness, but from overwhelming relief. The first impossible hurdle had been cleared. She had real, tangible value. The hotel could be saved. It was actually possible. But Marcus had been right about the publicity. Within days, word leaked. $1 million wine collection found in abandoned hotel, the headline screamed. The story went viral. News crews showed up in Astoria. Reporters called Sarah constantly. The small coastal town suddenly buzzed with interest in the hotel that had been written off as a lost cause. The attention brought both support and increased scrutiny. Some locals rallied around Sarah, proud that the Hartley Grand might be saved. They organized a community meeting to discuss how the town could help. The Historical Society offered to provide documentation and research. Local contractors volunteered discounted labor. Harold showed up with 3 other retired men, all of whom had fond memories of the hotel, ready to help however they could. But others grew more hostile. The developer who'd offered $5,000 for the property showed up at Sarah's cottage, angry. "You knew," he accused. "You knew there was value there, and you played us all for fools." Sarah, exhausted and on edge, snapped back. "I knew there was a ruin. Everything I found after accepting the inheritance, after everyone told me I was making a mistake." The developer left threatening legal action, claiming Sarah had somehow defrauded him, though Mr. Whitmore assured her there was no legal basis for any claim. "He's angry because he missed an opportunity," the lawyer said. "Nothing he can do about it now. The property and everything in it is legally yours." Security became an issue. Sarah hired a local security company to patrol the hotel grounds, especially at night. The cost strained her already tight budget, but with treasures still potentially hidden in the building, she couldn't risk it. She moved the jewelry to a safety deposit box, not yet ready to sell it, but needing it protected. The publicity did bring one unexpected benefit: donations. People who'd stayed at the hotel in its glory days, who'd celebrated anniversaries or honeymoons or family vacations there, began sending checks. Small amounts mostly, $20 here, $50 there. But they added up. Along with the checks came letters and stories about what the Hartley Grand had meant to them. Sarah read each letter, often in tears. A woman whose husband had proposed to her on the hotel's cliffside path. A man who'd spent every childhood summer there and still remembered the smell of the dining room at breakfast. A couple who danced to a live band in the ballroom on their wedding night. The hotel had been more than just a building. It had been a place where life's significant moments happened, where memories were made and treasured. She pinned some of the letters to a board in her cottage, a reminder when doubt crept in. These people believed in what she was doing. They wanted the hotel saved, not for profit, but for the intangible value of preserving something beautiful and meaningful. Their faith bolstered her own. In February, a historical preservation organization in Portland contacted her. They'd heard about the hotel and wanted to discuss grant opportunities. Sarah met with them, presenting her plans, and Robert the engineer's phased restoration approach. The organization was impressed, both by her preparation and her commitment. "We can't fund the entire restoration," the director told her, "but we can get you started. There's a federal emergency stabilization grant you qualify for. It's competitive, but with the publicity around your story and the historical significance of the property, you're a strong candidate. We'll help you with the application." The application took weeks to complete. Sarah worked on it late into every night, documenting every detail of the hotel's condition, its historical importance, the restoration plans. She submitted it in early March, was told a decision would come by June, and tried to be patient. Meanwhile, she continued working at the hotel. With Harold and his crew of retired volunteers, they began the basic stabilization work she could afford with donation money and by selling a few of the least valuable silver pieces. They boarded up broken windows properly, secured doors, cleared dangerous debris. It wasn't restoration, but it was protection, preventing further deterioration while she waited for real funding. Emma helped too, on weekends. Sarah had been hesitant to bring her daughter into the ruined building, but Emma begged, and with careful supervision in the safe areas, Sarah relented. Emma took to it with enthusiasm, helping clear rubble, organizing salvaged materials, painting signs for what each room had been. For this was the library, she'd announce, standing in a gutted space. "When it's fixed, I'll read every book." The community meeting about the hotel led to the formation of a Friends of the Hartley Grand organization. Local volunteers who wanted to see the restoration succeed. They held fundraisers, small events that brought in a few $1,000s here and there. A bake sale at the community center, a concert by local musicians. Every dollar helped, and more than the money, Sarah felt the weight of support, of people invested in her dream. But not everyone was supportive. At the grocery store one day, Sarah overheard two women talking in the next aisle. "That woman with the hotel? I heard she's just going to sell everything and run. All this talk about restoration is just to drive up the price." The other woman agreed. "Typical. Come in, make a bunch of promises, take the money and leave. That hotel's never reopening." Sarah wanted to confront them, to defend herself, but she simply left, hurt and angry. The doubt others had in her was exhausting. She was working herself to the bone, had given up any semblance of a normal life, all for a building most people thought should be demolished. Some days, the weight of skepticism and judgment was almost harder to bear than the physical labor. March brought the auction. Sarah took the bus to Portland, unable to afford missing work for more than a day. The auction house was elegant, filled with well-dressed collectors and wine enthusiasts. Sarah felt out of place in her best dress, which was still obviously inexpensive, but Marcus greeted her warmly and gave her a seat in the front row. "However this goes," he told her, "so you should be proud. This is one of the most significant wine discoveries in Oregon's history. The story alone is remarkable, but the quality of what you found, that's what brings people here today." The auction started with smaller lots, building up to the Hartley Grand Collection. Sarah watched in amazement as bottles of wine sold for thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of dollars. Paddles flew up. Phones rang with absentee bids. The auctioneer's rapid-fire calls filled the room. When they reached her collection, the energy in the room intensified. The 1945 Lafitte Rothschild sold first. Bidding started at $50,000 and climbed quickly. Sarah watched the numbers rise: 70,000, 90,000, 100,000. Her heart pounded so hard she thought everyone could hear it. So the bidding slowed at 140,000, seemed to stall. Then a phone bidder came in at 150. One final counter from the room, 165,000, and the gavel fell. Sold. For one bottle of wine, Sarah had just made more than she'd earned in the last 5 years combined. She felt faint. And there were 22 more bottles to go. Not all reached the heights of the Lafitte, but every bottle exceeded expectations. By the time the last one sold, Sarah's portion after auction fees and Marcus's commission came to $983,000, just under $1 million, from wine hidden in a basement that everyone thought contained nothing but rubble. Sarah sat in the auction house, surrounded by strangers celebrating good deals and lamenting ones that got away, and tried to process what had just happened. Her life had changed, completely, fundamentally changed, in the span of 2 hours. Marcus found her after the auction, grinning. "You should celebrate. This is extraordinary. Do you know what you're going to do first?" Sarah knew exactly. Hire Robert and his crew to start real restoration, fix the roof, make the building weather-tight. Then phase 2, then 3, until it's done. However long it takes. She returned to Astoria the next day with a certified check that felt impossibly heavy for a piece of paper. At the bank, she opened a dedicated restoration account, depositing the funds with strict instructions that they could only be used for hotel-related expenses. She wouldn't let herself be tempted to skim for personal needs. This money had a purpose, and she'd honor it. Word of the auction results spread quickly. The local paper ran another story. Hotel wine sells for nearly $1 million. Restoration moves forward. This time, the tone was different, respectful instead of skeptical. People stopped Sarah on the street to congratulate her. The grocery store women who doubted her avoided eye contact when they saw her in the produce section. Sarah felt vindication, yes, but also something more complicated. She hadn't done this for recognition or to prove doubters wrong. She'd done it because walking away felt like abandoning not just a building, but the people who'd loved it, the grandmother who'd sacrificed for it, the possibility that beautiful things could be saved. The validation from others was nice, but the validation she gave herself mattered more. With funds available, work began in earnest. Robert brought his full crew in April, once the spring weather stabilized. They started with emergency stabilization, shoring up walls, supporting the damaged structure, making everything safe before attempting repairs. Sarah watched crews swarm over the building, scaffolding rising against the Victorian walls, the sound of hammering and sawing replacing years of silence. The roof replacement took 2 months. Watching the new roof take shape, seeing the hotel protected from weather for the first time in over a decade, filled Sarah with joy so intense it hurt. Emma came with her every day after school, sitting on the hood of their car, drawing pictures of the hotel's transformation. The stack of drawings grew, a visual timeline of resurrection. In June, the federal grant came through, $45,000 for historical preservation. Combined with her auction money, Sarah now had over $1 million to work with. Not enough for complete restoration, but enough to make serious progress. She authorized work on the electrical systems, the plumbing, the structural reinforcements. Slowly, room by room, the hotel came back from the edge of collapse. But money wasn't the only need. Sarah was exhausted. Running between the hotel, her job at a new restaurant in Astoria, and caring for Emma left her hollowed out. She couldn't maintain this pace forever. That's when Harold made a suggestion. "You need to move into the hotel," he said. "I know it's not done, but there must be rooms that are habitable now. Live there, manage the restoration full-time. This is your business now, Sarah. Treat it like one." It was terrifying and thrilling in equal measure, but he was right. With the ground floor largely restored, with working plumbing and electricity in some sections, the hotel was technically livable. Sarah picked a small suite of rooms that had been managers' quarters, worked with the crew to get them finished first, and in July, she and Emma moved into the Hartley Grand Hotel. Their furniture looked absurd in the large rooms, but Emma loved it. She had space to run, could explore the safe areas of the hotel, felt like she lived in a castle. Sarah set up a temporary office in what would eventually become the hotel's main office, managing restoration during the day and doing bookkeeping late into the night. Living in the hotel changed everything. Sarah noticed details she'd missed before and understood the building's rhythm and personality. She found more small treasures, nothing as dramatic as the wine or jewelry, but valuable nonetheless. A collection of vintage postcards depicting the hotel in its prime, antique furniture in the attic that could be restored, guest books signed by famous visitors, documents that added to the hotel's historical significance. The jewelry she decided to sell only partially. The emerald necklace and a few other significant pieces went to auction in August, bringing another $200,000. But some pieces, the ones with the most personal history, she kept. A simple gold locket containing a photo of her grandparents, a sapphire ring that had belonged to her great-great-grandmother. These she locked away, family heirlooms to pass to Emma someday, a tangible connection to the women who came before. By September, the transformation was undeniable. The exterior had been repaired and painted, the Victorian details restored to their original elegance. The wraparound porch had been rebuilt, safe and beautiful. Windows gleamed where boards had covered empty frames. The gardens, still wild, at least had paths cleared, and the worst of the overgrowth removed. The hotel looked lived in again, cared for, no longer a ruin, but a work in progress. The developer who'd wanted to tear it down drove by one day and stopped to look. Sarah was outside, directing a landscaping crew. He got out of his car, stared at the building for a long moment, then approached her. "I owe you an apology," he said stiffly. "I thought you were naive. Thought this was impossible. God, I was wrong." Sarah accepted the apology graciously, though part of her wanted to remind him of his hostility, his certainty that she'd fail. But she was learning that vindication didn't require rubbing people's noses in their mistakes. The hotel's transformation spoke for itself. As fall arrived, bringing the first anniversary of Sarah accepting the inheritance, she stood on the newly restored porch and took stock. The hotel wasn't finished. Full restoration would take years more, maybe a decade like Robert had warned. But it was saved. The core work was done. The building was secure, weather-tight, safe. Several guest rooms on the ground floor were fully restored, ready for eventual reopening. The dining room was taking shape, its elegant proportions visible again. And Sarah had changed too. The exhausted, but desperate woman who'd counted diner tips a year ago was gone, replaced by someone who walked with confidence, who managed contractors and budgets, who believed she could tackle impossible problems because she'd already done it. Emma had changed as well, thriving in ways Sarah hadn't anticipated. Her daughter took pride in the hotel, showing friends around, explaining restoration techniques she'd learned from watching the crews. She no longer felt shame about where they lived, but excitement about the future. The Friends of the Hartley Grand Group had grown to over 100 members. They held regular meetings at the hotel now, sitting in the restored library, planning grand reopening events still years away, documenting the hotel's history. Sarah had become a minor celebrity in preservation circles. I'm invited to speak about her experience at conferences and meetings. She always emphasized the same points. The importance of historical preservation? Yes, but more than that, the value of not giving up on things just because they seem impossible. In October, a film crew from a documentary series about architectural restoration came to shoot footage. They interviewed Sarah extensively, asking about the discoveries, the challenges, her motivation. "What made you think you could do this?" the interviewer asked. "When everyone said it was impossible, when you had no money and no experience, what made you believe?" Sarah thought carefully before answering. "I didn't believe, not really. I was terrified the whole time. But I thought about my grandmother, who'd given everything to this place, about all the people who'd made memories here, about my daughter, who deserved to see her mother fight for something beautiful instead of just surviving. I didn't need to believe I would succeed. I just needed to believe it was worth trying." The interview aired in December, bringing another wave of attention and support. Donations increased. More grants became available as the hotel's story spread. Sarah hired her first employee, a local woman named Grace, who'd worked in hospitality before, to help manage the business side, while Sarah focused on restoration. Christmas that year was magical. Sarah and Emma decorated the restored lobby with a massive tree, hung lights on the porch, and invited the entire community for an open house. Hundreds came, many returning to see rooms they remembered from decades ago. Harold walked through with tears in his eyes, remembering his anniversary celebration. Others took photos, comparing them to old pictures they'd brought, marveling at how accurately the restoration had captured the hotel's original character. An elderly couple approached Sarah during the party. "We were married here," the woman said, "in 1967. We never thought we'd see it restored. Thank you for giving us this gift." She handed Sarah an envelope. Inside was a check for $5,000. "For the ballroom," she explained. "That's where we danced on our wedding night. When you restore it, we'd like to dance there again." Sarah hugged them, overwhelmed. The ballroom wasn't scheduled for restoration for another 2 years. But she made a note. Prioritize the ballroom. Some things mattered more than construction schedules. As the year ended, Sarah sat in the restored office, and Emma asleep upstairs in their suite, and reviewed everything that had happened. A year ago, she'd been broke, desperate, clinging to hope by her fingernails. Now she managed a $1 million restoration project, had saved a piece of history, had given her daughter stability and a future. But more than that, she'd discovered something about herself. She wasn't just a survivor, wasn't just someone who endured hardship. She was someone who could build, create, transform ruins into beauty. The poverty and struggle of her past hadn't been meaningless. It had taught her resilience, taught her to see value where others saw waste, taught her that giving up was always the wrong choice. She opened Evelyn's journal to a passage she'd marked. July 10th, 1989. Today I watched a storm batter the hotel, waves crashing against the cliffs below, a wind threatening to tear the roof off. I stood in the lobby, listening to the building groan, and thought about all the storms we've weathered. Physical storms, financial storms, personal losses. The hotel stands. It always stands. That's what we do. We endure. Sarah added her own note in the margin. December 31st. The hotel stands. We endured. And now we build. The winter passed in continued work. Sarah pushed forward with interior restoration, always conscious of the budget, but no longer paralyzed by fear of running out. The jewelry sales had given her breathing room. More grants came through. The hotel's increasing fame brought consulting opportunities. Someone wanted to pay her to advise on another coastal hotel restoration. A magazine wanted to license photos for an article. Small revenue streams, but they added up. In February, and almost exactly a year after the wine auction, Sarah received an unexpected call. A wealthy tech entrepreneur who'd grown up in Astoria wanted to invest. Not a donation, but actual investment. He proposed fronting money for the final phases of restoration in exchange for a minority stake in the hotel once it reopened. Sarah was hesitant about giving up any ownership, but Mr. Whitmore helped her negotiate a deal that protected her interests while providing the capital she needed. With new funding secured, Sarah made a decision. The hotel would open its doors, at least partially, by the end of the year. Not the full operation, but enough. 12 guest rooms, the dining room, the library. A soft opening to test systems and train staff, to start generating revenue, to prove the hotel could be not just restored, but operational. The work intensified. Sarah hired more staff, trained Emma's former babysitter as a housekeeper, brought Grace's daughter in to help with front desk operations. By summer, trial runs began. Friends and family were invited to stay free, to test the experience, provide feedback. The rooms were beautiful, blending restored historical details with modern amenities. The dining room, under the direction of a chef Sarah had recruited from Portland, served elegant meals showcasing local seafood and produce. In September, 2 years after Sarah first learned about her inheritance, the Hartley Grand Hotel officially reopened. Not fully, not completely, but open. The first paying guests arrived on a Friday evening, a couple celebrating their anniversary, booked for a weekend. Sarah greeted them personally, her hands shaking with nervous energy. "Welcome to the Hartley Grand," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The soft opening was successful beyond expectations. Word spread through travel blogs and review sites. The hotel's story, the dramatic restoration, the discovery of hidden treasures, all of it created buzz. Bookings poured in. Sarah had to turn people away, promising rooms would be available once more. Phases opened. The revenue, even from limited operations, was significant. Enough to fund ongoing restoration, to start paying back the investor, to give Sarah and Emma financial security she'd never dreamed possible. By October, Sarah could finally afford to pay herself a real salary. She opened her first paycheck and cried. It was more than she'd made in a month at the diner, and it came from something she'd built, something she owned. So Emma started school in Astoria, no longer the poor kid with worn clothes and quiet shame. She invited friends over proudly, showed them her room in the hotel, told them about the restoration. She talked about becoming an architect or preservationist someday, about saving other buildings like her mother had saved the Hartley Grand. Sarah listened to her daughter's dreams and felt pride so intense it was almost painful. That November, the documentary about the hotel aired. Millions of people watched Sarah's story, saw the transformation from ruin to resurrection. The hotel's website crashed from traffic. The phone rang constantly with booking requests, press inquiries, people wanting to share their own memories of the Hartley Grand. And through it all, Sarah remained grounded. She knew how close she'd come to giving up, how many times she'd nearly accepted defeat. The difference between failure and success hadn't been talent or luck alone, though both played roles. It had been stubbornness, the refusal to believe that impossible meant impossible, the willingness to keep going when every logical voice said, "Stop." On Christmas Eve, Sarah hosted another community celebration. The ballroom, promised to the elderly couple, had been completed ahead of schedule. They danced there again, 55 years after their wedding, to music played by a local string quartet. The entire town seemed to attend, packing the restored spaces, celebrating not just the hotel, but what it represented, the possibility of redemption, the value of preserving beauty, the power of determined hope. Harold found Sarah in a quiet moment, standing on the porch watching guests arrive. "Your grandmother would be proud," he said simply. Sarah nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She thought about Evelyn often, wondered what she'd think of the restored hotel, hoped she'd approve of the changes Sarah had made. The modern updates blended respectfully with historical preservation. Imagined her stern face softening with satisfaction. As midnight approached and the year turned, Sarah reflected on the journey. From a woman who'd bought a ruined hotel for $1 in inheritance, who'd found hidden treasures buried by a grandmother she'd never known, who'd fought through mockery and doubt and exhaustion to save something beautiful. The financial transformation was real and significant. Sarah and Emma would never face eviction or hunger again. The hotel provided security, comfort, a future. But the deeper transformation was internal. Sarah had discovered she was capable of extraordinary things, had learned that poverty hadn't made her weak or worthless, but had instead forged a strength she hadn't known she possessed. She'd taken nothing and created something, had looked at ruins and seen possibility, had found treasure in the dust, both literal gold and jewels, and the more valuable treasure of self-belief. The Hartley Grand Hotel stood on its cliff, lights blazing against the winter night, music and laughter floating from its windows. Ships passing in the Pacific would see it, a beacon of warmth and welcome, just as they had in the hotel's glory, days a century before. Inside, guests celebrated, made memories, danced and ate, and marveled at the beautiful restoration. And in the office, Sarah sat with the books, planning the next phases, the East Wing to be restored next year, the gardens to be fully landscaped the year after, the private beach path to be rebuilt. Always more work, always the next challenge. But challenges felt different now. They felt like opportunities, not obstacles, like puzzles she knew she could solve, given time and effort. Emma burst into the office just before midnight, pulling Sarah to the ballroom for the countdown. They stood together among the celebrating crowd as voices counted down the seconds. And when midnight struck and cheers erupted, Sarah held her daughter close, and felt gratitude so profound it was almost a physical presence. She'd been given a miracle, yes, in the form of hidden treasures. But the real miracle was what she'd done with them. The choice to fight instead of surrender. The decision to build instead of just survive. The belief, however shaky, that she deserved more than poverty and resignation. That she could create beauty and security, not just for herself, but for her daughter, for her community, for everyone who walked through the hotel's doors. The mockery she'd faced seemed distant now, unimportant. Those who doubted her either apologized or stayed silent. But Sarah didn't need their validation anymore. She'd found validation in the work itself, in the transformation she'd accomplished, in the life she'd built from ruins. As the celebration continued around her, Sarah slipped away to the porch one more time. The Pacific stretched endlessly before her, waves catching moonlight, the horizon promising infinite possibilities. Behind her, the hotel hummed with life and warmth. Ahead, the future waited, uncertain, but no longer frightening. Sarah Chen had inherited a ruin and turned it into a legacy, had discovered that treasure wasn't just what you found buried in basements, but what you built with your own hands. Had learned that the most valuable inheritance wasn't money or jewels, but the courage to believe you deserved better and the determination to make it happen. The hotel stood. She stood. And that was everything. The story of the Hartley Grand Hotel's restoration spread far beyond Astoria in the years that followed. Sarah became a sought-after speaker at preservation conferences, sharing not just the dramatic tale of hidden treasures, but the practical realities of phased restoration, of balancing historical accuracy with modern needs, of building a sustainable business from ruins. The hotel itself thrived. Each year brought new phases of completion. The East Wing opened in year 3. The gardens, restored to their Victorian splendor, with native plants and winding paths, became a destination in their own right. The beach path was rebuilt, allowing guests to descend the cliff to a private stretch of shore, where Emma and her friends spent summer afternoons exploring tide pools. By the 5th year after reopening, the Hartley Grand was not just restored, but celebrated. It earned recognition from historical societies, travel awards, features in national magazines. But more meaningful to Sarah were the guest books filled with heartfelt comments. Families who made it an annual tradition. Couples who chose it for proposals and anniversaries. People who simply wanted to experience a place where beauty and history were honored, and where profit hadn't eclipsed purpose. Emma grew up in the hotel, helping with operations as she got older. She understood the business in ways Sarah never could have taught directly, learning through observation and participation. On her 16th birthday, Sarah gave her the emerald necklace, the one from the attic trunk, passing down the family heirloom as Evelyn's grandfather had intended generations before. The chain of women continued, unbroken, despite years of estrangement and loss. Sarah never forgot where she'd started. She established a scholarship fund for hospitality students from low-income backgrounds, wanting others to have opportunities she'd been denied. She mentored other aspiring preservationists, particularly women facing similar situations of overwhelming odds and limited resources. And she kept one room in the hotel permanently set aside, offered free twice a month to families in need, giving them a weekend of beauty and peace away from the grind of poverty. The cottage where she and Emma had first lived in Astoria became employee housing, then later a small museum dedicated to the hotel's history. Sarah filled it with photographs documenting the restoration, with some of Evelyn's personal belongings, with the story of hidden treasures and determined hope. Visitors walked through and saw not just the before and after transformation, but the human story behind it. On the 10th anniversary of taking ownership, Sarah stood on the hotel's porch at sunset, watching the Pacific paint itself in gold and crimson. The building behind her was fully restored now, every room complete, every system modern and efficient while respecting historical character. The hotel operated at capacity most of the year, employed 40 local residents, contributed significantly to Astoria's economy. But Sarah's mind wasn't on financial success or recognition. She was thinking about a morning 10 years ago when she'd counted $42 in tips and wondered how she'd pay rent. Thinking about the leap of faith required to accept a crumbling hotel instead of $5,000. Thinking about every moment of doubt, every obstacle that had seemed insurmountable, every voice that had told her to quit. She'd been right not to listen. Right to believe that some things were worth fighting for, even when logic said otherwise. Right to trust that hard work and determination could transform ruins into resurrection. So the Hartley Grand Hotel stood as proof that impossible was just another word for difficult, that legacies could be rebuilt, that a single decision made from desperation and hope could change everything. As darkness fell and lights blazed from every window of the restored Victorian mansion, Sarah smiled. She'd found treasure in the dust, yes. But more than that, she'd discovered treasure within herself, the strength and capability that poverty had hidden but not destroyed. That was the real inheritance Evelyn had left her, not the wine or jewelry or silver, but the opportunity to prove to herself what she could accomplish when everything was on the line. The hotel would outlast her, Sarah knew, would stand for another century or more, hosting future generations of guests, creating new memories, preserving beauty for people not yet born. And somewhere in that future, perhaps another woman would stand where Sarah stood now, would read about the restoration, would find inspiration in the story of a single mother who'd been given ruins and refused to accept that ruins were all they'd ever be. That thought pleased Sarah more than any award or recognition ever could. The story mattered. Hope mattered. The stubborn, illogical, beautiful refusal to give up when everyone said you should, that mattered most of all. She turned and walked back inside, ready for the evening's work. There were guests to greet, staff to manage, details to oversee. The work never truly ended, but Sarah wouldn't have it any other way. This was her life now, built from nothing, sustained by determination, enriched by purpose. She'd been given a chance, and she'd seized it with both hands and refused to let go. And in doing so, she'd saved not just a building, but herself. 20 years after Sarah first signed the deed transfer papers, the Hartley Grand Hotel celebrated an anniversary that few could have predicted. The morning dawned bright and clear, unusual for the Oregon coast in November, as if the weather itself wanted to honor the occasion. Sarah, now in her 50s, moved through the hotel's kitchen with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent decades perfecting every detail. Her hair had gone silver at the temples, and fine lines creased her face, but her eyes held the same fierce determination that had carried her through those early impossible years. The celebration was Emma's idea. Emma, now 27, and the hotel's operations manager, had spent months planning an event that would bring together everyone who'd been part of the journey. Former volunteers, the original contractor crew, guests who'd stayed during the soft opening, even some of the skeptics who'd eventually become supporters. In the restored ballroom, tables were being set with the hotel's finest china, pieces Sarah had discovered in yet another hidden storage room years ago. The silver service, or what remained of it after selling some pieces, gleamed on display in the library. And on the walls throughout the hotel hung photographs documenting the transformation, a visual timeline that visitors often studied with awe. Marcus Chen, who'd authenticated the wine collection, arrived early with his teenage daughter. "I tell everyone this story," he said to Sarah as they embraced, about the woman who found a fortune in a basement and used it to build something even more valuable. You're a legend in auction circles. Harold had passed away 5 years earlier, but his children came, bringing photos of their father working on the hotel's porch reconstruction. He talked about this place constantly in his final years, his son told Sarah. Said it proved that community still mattered, that people helping each other could accomplish miracles. He was prouder of his volunteer work here than anything else he'd done. Mr. Whitmore, retired now but still sharp, arrived with his grandson. I've handled thousands of estate cases, he told the young man as Sarah listened. But this is the one that restored my faith in human determination. Your grandmother would have loved her, Evelyn. They were cut from the same cloth. As guests gathered, Sarah found herself drawn to the office where she'd spent countless sleepless nights managing budgets and wrestling with impossible decisions. The room looked different now, professional and polished, but she could still see the ghost of her younger self hunched over spreadsheets, terrified and determined in equal measure. Emma found her there. "Mom, they're ready for your speech." Sarah nodded, taking a moment to collect herself. The speech she'd prepared felt inadequate to capture everything she wanted to say. In the ballroom, faces turned toward her as she approached the podium. Some she knew intimately, others were strangers who'd simply heard the story and wanted to witness this milestone. Sarah looked out at them and set her prepared notes aside. "I'm not going to give you the speech I wrote," she began. "Instead, I want to tell you about a moment you might not know about. It happened in year 7 of the restoration. We'd run out of money again. A major structural issue had been discovered that insurance wouldn't cover. I was sitting in my car in the hotel parking lot at 2 a.m, crying so hard I could barely breathe, ready to sell everything and walk away." The room was silent. Emma's eyes widened. This was a story Sarah had never shared. "I looked at the hotel," Sarah continued, "and I saw all the work we'd done, all the progress, and I thought about quitting, just being done with the stress and the struggle. And then I remembered something. I remembered counting $42 in tips at a diner, thinking that was my ceiling. That life would never offer me more than just enough to survive. And I realized that even if I failed, even if the hotel ultimately defeated me, I'd already succeeded in the only way that truly mattered. I'd proven to myself that I could dream bigger, fight harder, and refuse to accept limitations others tried to place on me." She paused, her voice thick with emotion. "So I dried my tears, went inside, and figured out solution number 217. Because that's what you do when you've come this far. You find another way, and another, and another, until either you succeed or you've exhausted every possibility." I wasn't ready to say I'd exhausted every possibility. The ballroom erupted in applause. Sarah saw tears on many faces, understanding in their eyes. They'd all fought their own battles and faced their own moments of wanting to quit. Later, as the celebration continued with music and dancing, Sarah walked the hotel grounds with Emma. They followed the cliff path down to the beach, where waves crashed against the rocks in their eternal rhythm. "I've been offered a partnership in a hotel group in Seattle," Emma said quietly. "They want to replicate what we've done here. Historic properties, restoration-focused, community-centered." Sarah's heart clenched, but she kept her voice steady. "What did you tell them?" "That I needed to talk to you first. But Mom, I think I want to do it. I want to help save other places like you saved this one. And the hotel, it doesn't need me anymore. It's established. It runs smoothly. You've built an incredible team." Sarah stopped walking and turned to her daughter. "You're right. Go. Take everything you've learned and multiply it. Build your own legacy instead of just maintaining mine." Emma hugged her fiercely. "I'll come back. Visit constantly. This is home." "I know," Sarah said, "but home isn't just a place. It's knowing you have the strength to build new homes wherever you go. I gave you that gift, or maybe you inherited it from generations of strong women. Either way, it's yours." They stood together on the beach as sunset painted the sky, 3 generations of determination flowing through them like the waves flowing over stone. Sarah thought about Evelyn, about her mother, about all the women whose struggles and triumphs had led to this moment. The hotel would continue. Emma would build her own success, and Sarah, she'd keep doing what she'd always done, finding treasure in unexpected places, or refusing to accept that anything beautiful was beyond saving. The work wasn't finished. It never truly would be. But that was fine. Sarah had learned long ago that the work itself was the point, that purpose came from the doing, not the completion. As they climbed back up the cliff path, Sarah looked at the hotel glowing against the darkening sky and felt profound gratitude. Not just for the treasures she'd found, but for the chance to prove that resilience wasn't just about surviving, but about transforming struggle into something magnificent. The Hartley Grand stood eternal, a testament to the power of refusing to give up. And Sarah Chen stood with it, no longer the desperate woman who'd gambled everything on a ruin, but the architect of her own resurrection, and proof that the greatest treasures aren't found buried in basements, but built with determination, one impossible day at a time. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.